Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and thanks for checking out another Turning Wheels podcast where today I'm going to talk about all of my mechanical mistakes. These are all the mistakes that I've made, well, the bigger ones, while learning how to repair cars on my own. So I never had advice from nobody. I never went to school for any of this. It was all experience, just picking up a wrench and trying. And you're always going to fail. You're always going to have your failures. And I've had some small failures, some big failures. And today we're going to talk about some of the biggest ones. And so we'll start off with the RX8 story. Basically, I was working on a Mazda RX8 in my driveway. And I don't know why, but I had this great idea that I was going to jack up this RX8 and put this aftermarket exhaust on it. So I got underneath the car. I jacked it up. I put all 4 jack stands underneath the car. And I slid under the car. I'm looking at this exhaust. And I'm like, wow, this is not going to work. Every single bolt was rusted to hell. They were already rounded, and mind you, it's the factory exhaust on the car. So first thing I did was I sprayed everything down with WD-40, was getting all ready, and I was like, all right, cool, I'm gonna get underneath here, I'm gonna try, see what happens. Well, of course, my sockets were just spinning. So I ran to the hardware store, got some bolt extractors. They actually started working. I got one of the bolts out, and the other bolt, it gripped onto it, and it actually snapped the head off of the bolt. I couldn't slide it off. And so this stud was about this long. I didn't have enough room, and I was like, I'm gonna have to cut this thing. So I'm underneath the car. By the way, I had the car, if the driveway is like this, I didn't have the car like this. I had the car like this. And I had the car level like this. So these jack stands were up higher, and these were up lower. Either way, so I'm underneath this car, shaking this exhaust around, trying to get it. I mean, the whole car's moving, and I just was using none of my brain cells. I was like, you know what? I'm going to go get my Dremel. I'm going to get a cutoff wheel, and I'm going to cut off basically the broken bolt. So the head came off the bolt. Now we got this much left, and I was like, what am I going to do? So I grabbed a pair of vice grips first. I tried twisting it out. Wasn't working. It was completely seized up. So I went underneath the car, took my Dremel, and I cut the exhaust stud off, right down to the flange on the factory exhaust. So if this is the flange and the stud's sticking out like this, I mean, I cut it flat up against the flange. Then I crawl back out, I go get my drill bit kit, I come back with some drill bits and I start drilling, taking forever, just drilling, trying to get this stud drilled out of the factory exhaust. And I finally get it, it breaks loose and the factory stud comes out. I'm like, cool. I get the new exhaust up, I hang it up, I put the new bolts in, I put the new nuts on, I torque everything down. I'm like, awesome, all done. I'm gonna climb out from under this car, we're gonna see how it sounds. So I climb out from under the car, and I'm not even kidding you. I put my hands on the ground like this, pushed myself, slid out from underneath the car, stood up, and that car went boom. The jack stands on the lower side kicked out, and the car just went boom, boom. Like they slid off these jack stands and came off of these and just dropped straight on the ground. And it was a low car. And I would have been completely crushed. Had I been under that car for 5 seconds longer, I would have probably been dead. So crazy. I know I should have never done that, but it's a big mistake that I made because I just wasn't using my brain. So that's mistake number 1. Let me see what else I have on my list here. Oh, so fast forward to like 2017, I think it was that I had this. I got a 2015 Subaru WRX. Did a couple of mods to it. You guys know I'm a big Subaru guy, so it was on E85, everything except the upgraded turbo. And the car was making good power, I was having fun with it, and I fried the clutch. So I was like, all right, the factory clutch took a dump, let me go get a new clutch. So I went and ordered a new clutch. At the time, I'd never installed an aftermarket clutch before. I've reinstalled OEM clutches where they were like a full assembly. So my old Eagle Talons and Eclipses, the 428 Dodge Neon motors and stuff, they would use a single piece clutch where the disc and everything was all in one piece. You just bolt it to the flywheel and you're done. So I was unfamiliar with the pressure plate and disc being separate. And so I installed the disc, I installed the pressure plate. And at the time of doing this, I actually pulled the motor rather than the transmission because I thought it'd be easier to pull the motor. So I pulled the motor, did it that way. And then I put everything back in and I'm like, this is just not right. The clutch didn't feel right. The car wouldn't start. And when it would finally start, it would just immediately die. I was like, something's wrong. And so I started doing some research online and everyone's like, make sure that your clutch disc is installed the correct way. And I'm like, there's a correct side? Because to me, it looked like both sides were the same, right? They're not. And I didn't know that. So I'm like, oh my God, like I don't know what I did. So I'm like, all right, cool. I pull the whole thing back apart. I get in there, and sure enough, my clutch disc is installed backwards. And because I installed it backwards and tried to start the car, it shredded it. I mean, it was all chewed up. So I ordered a new clutch disc, put it back in the car, reinstalled everything, and we were good to go. But that was another really crappy one. And then I had my 1999 Eclipse GSX. And I did a lot to this car. It's on my channel. If you guys are curious, you can go watch all the videos. I have a 10-minute build video on it and all that fun stuff of me building this car. Well, essentially, I bought it as a shell, and I needed an engine for it. So I went on eBay, not the best place to buy stuff, but I went on eBay, and I bought an eBay engine. But it was an engine and transmission combo that I needed. And I had a 99 GSX. This was from a 95. So I knew I'd have to change like the cam position sensors and stuff like that, but it wasn't a big deal. It was an all-wheel drive setup, so all-wheel drive transmission, transfer case, it came with everything that I needed. I was like, cool. So it had all the pictures of the all-wheel drive setup. I get it in the mail, and it comes with a front-wheel drive transmission. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I messaged the seller, and I was like, hey, you advertise this as an all-wheel drive setup. This is a 95 7-bolt 4G63 motor, but it's mated to a front-wheel drive transmission, and you had it advertised as an all-wheel drive setup, and it's not. Even your pictures showed the all-wheel drive transmission, and this is a front-wheel drive transmission. So I'm like, great, what am I going to do? And the seller's like, oh, well, you can ship me back the front-wheel drive transmission, and I'll ship you out an all-wheel drive one. I said, so now it's my burden to send this one back to you, pay for freight, shipping, and everything else. There's no way. Well, of course, I fought it on eBay. I lost the case because they basically told me the same thing. Well, send the other one back. I wasn't going through the trouble. So I got the new transmission. I put the clutch on the motor. I bolted up the transmission, put the starter on, dropped everything into the car, and I went to start it, and it just wouldn't start. It cranked for a second and stopped. I was like, what the heck? And then it was making a grinding noise. Well, I checked, and the ear broke off of the starter. So basically where the starter comes out and the bolts go through the bell housing to hold it on, they snapped off. What the heck? I must have got a bad starter. So I went to the auto store, bought a new starter, because that's the only thing I needed to fire up the car. I went to the auto store, bought a new starter, brought it back, went to crank it, did the same thing. That's two starters back to back, one of them being brand new. Obviously, I'm not going to exchange it for another one, and the same thing happens. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So I started doing research, and people were like, oh, you have the wrong starter plate. And I was like, what do you mean? How do I have the wrong? They sent me the front-wheel drive transmission with the engine, which the engine had the starter plate bolted to it. So the engine transmission combo was front-wheel drive, came with a front-wheel drive starter plate. I forget if the flywheel is slightly smaller or larger on the front-wheel drive. I think it's slightly larger on the front-wheel drive. And so the starters just moved ever so slightly on the front-wheel drive. And so because of that, it was snapping. It was breaking the starter. So I had to go and source a all-wheel drive starter plate. And so I have the engine and transmission already in the car, and now I have to pull the transmission back out. And I'm like, you're kidding me, right? So I unbolt the transmission, I lower it down from the car, I order the new starter plate, I get the starter plate, and I'm like, cool, I'm ready to install the new transmission. Well, I asked somebody for help, and this person that asked for help, just moral of the story is always be careful who you trust helping you with your car. I had the transmission on a jack, just a regular floor jack with like a little piece of wood. Basically, it was like a couple 2x4s making a square to sit the transmission on. And it was sitting on that, and it was underneath the car, and I told this person, I said, all you have to do is keep this jack steady. Just hold the jack handle and keep it steady, and when I ask you to, just slightly pump it up or down, whether I need the transmission to move. And they agreed, and I was like, cool. So I'm underneath the car with this transmission, and I have it lined up almost perfect. I'm like, hey, can you pump it up a little bit? All right, cool, we got it. I'm almost there. All right, hold steady, don't let go. And so I grabbed my bolt, I reached down, I grabbed my bolt, I put the first bolt through, and I was like just about to thread that sucker in. And the transmission just shifts, and I was like kind of like pulled back, and the thing just drops right in front of me. And I'm like, oh my God. I look out, I'm like, what are you doing? And the person that asked to help me is sitting there on their phone texting. And I'm like, you're kidding me, right? So You were supposed to be holding this jack for me, and instead you let go at the most crucial moment to text somebody on your phone. When this transmission fell forward, it caught onto one of the wiring harnesses and ripped the wire connector off. As it was falling, it grabbed onto the oil feed line for the turbo and ripped it. It was a braided oil feed line, and it ripped it. And then it goes down and it hits the brand new aluminum radiator and then smacks the floor and cracks the bell housing. So I had to rewire the plug, drain the coolant, put a new radiator in there, refill the coolant, do the oil line again, new oil line, and then I just dealt with the crack on the bell housing. I was like, I'm just putting this thing in and hopefully it'll last for a while. So yeah, that was another fun one. What else do we have here? I made a list. And the other one dates back a little bit. That was a 1997 Eclipse GST Spider. And basically, it blew up right before summertime. And it got a really bad rod knock. And I pulled the motor. I went and bought a new motor. Rather than building it, I was like, I just want the car back on the road. I went and bought a used motor. I pulled everything out in my driveway, dropped everything back in. It took me a couple of months because I had no experience whatsoever. I was learning as I went. I was working a full-time job. Didn't really have a whole lot of time to work on this thing. And so I was just doing it here and there as I could, and I finally got it back together, and I got the car running. And one of the things that I installed while the car was down was actually an HKS turbo timer. So I put it underneath the steering wheel, it was all wired up into the ignition, and everything was plug and play. It was a full plug and play kit, so I didn't have to hardwire or splice anything. Well, it was like the third or fourth day that I had it running. I was driving it to work, and the car randomly shut off at a red light and wouldn't start back up. And I was like, uh-oh, what am I gonna do? So I'm like freaking out, put my hazards on. I'm like trying to start the car, nothing's happening. I'm like, what's going on? I pop the hood and I look at the fuse panel and my ignition relay or my ignition fuse is blown. And I was like, that's weird. So I didn't have that same size, so I grabbed the next size up. It was like 10 amps more. I put that fuse in, the car fired right up. I was like, that was weird. Drove to work, it was fine. I was driving home, car shut off again. And this time while I was moving, and I'm like, this is not good. So I put hazards on, I pulled over, I checked, sure enough, the fuse was blown. Now, for future reference, this was a very valuable lesson. If there's ever a fuse blowing, there's something wrong. That fuse is there to prevent something bad from happening because there's obviously a short somewhere, a bad ground, there's something going on that's causing that fuse to blow. And at the time, I didn't really know that. I didn't really think too much on it. I was still learning. I was only 17 years old at the time, so I had just started driving, just started working on cars, and I was like, I don't know what this is. So I pulled out my last extra fuse, I put it in the car, and I started driving, and it went out immediately, again. And I was like, what is going on? I'm like freaking out, trying to get the car home, and I had this idea. I was like, well, the fuse is just two pieces of metal that connect together and allow the circuit to pass through. So what if I just take a piece of metal and I bend it down and install it where the fuse goes? I don't remember if it was a paper clip or a piece of metal or what it was, but I found something and I used it to plug where the fuse went. I plugged it in, car fired right up. I was like, perfect, we're good to go. And I'm driving down the road and I start smelling something. I'm like, uh-oh, that's not good, I should pull over. Well, around the time I said that, I start seeing smoke coming out from under the hood. So I whip over quick, the car shuts off again. I whip over quick and I just see black smoke. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like checking the car. I pop the hood and my wire harness is on fire. Just a big group of wires going across the firewall is on fire. The insulation on the firewall is on fire. And everything's just melting. And I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I'm like freaking out. I took my shirt off. I'm like smacking the freaking fire. And finally the fire goes out. And all the wires on the back firewall are melted. All the insulation on the firewall is melted. There's burn marks on everything. The hood insulation is all burnt up. And I was just like, oh my God. Like, what am I going to do? That's my engine harness. At the time, I didn't really know what that would entail. I thought I was going to have to rewire the entire car because of this engine harness. I was like, I don't, that's too much work. I don't know how to do all that. So I did something that only a 17-year-old who has no idea what he's doing would do. I called the scrapyard and asked them to come pick up my car. So they came and picked up my Eclipse GST convertible and gave me $250 for it and took the car. That was a really dumb mistake and a really hard lesson. That was the only thing wrong with the car. I had just spent thousands of dollars getting the car back on the road, and then I threw it away because of me being stupid, both for the fuse issue and again for getting rid of it just because of a melted wire harness. So my last story is actually not that long ago. This is probably only 2.5, 3 years ago. I had my old 2020 WRX, and that I did a full STI drivetrain swap, so transmission, differential, all that jazz. And I was working at Import Image Racing at the time down in Florida, and I was on a 9 to 5 schedule. And so at the end of the day, that was the only time I had to work on the car. And people were only in the warehouse from like 5 to 5:30, and I had to leave when everyone locked up. So I had like 30 minutes to an hour at the end of each day to work on the car. So the first day, I think I got the transmission out of the car. Super easy. I pulled the rear diff, I pulled the axles, I pulled the drive shaft, I pulled the transmission, boom, out of the car. The very next day, I got the STI differential in and the STI axles in and installed all that. So the rear end was done. The following day I came in and I went to install the transmission, and that's where I ran into a bunch of problems because I could not lift that transmission. I don't know if anyone has experience with this, but the STI transmission weighs a lot more than the WRX transmission, a lot more. And so I asked my coworkers to help me. They were all busy at the time. They're like, hey, we'll help you out tomorrow. So I went home for the night. I came back the next day. I had that little window at the end of the day. I felt bad asking my coworkers to stay after work to help me with this, but I needed help bench pressing this thing in. So they come out to help me, and we're all struggling to try and lift this thing up, and we cannot get it lined up, and I'm freaking out. I'm having all these issues. I'm like, this sucks. 2 or 3 days, I think, was spent having people come out and try and help me line this thing up. I don't know why. Because I didn't have a transmission jack, I couldn't properly adjust it. I didn't have a lift, and so I just had 2 different jacks underneath trying to jack up the transmission. The back would be too far down, then we get the back upright, and the front would be too far down. We'd lift the front up, and it would turn or it'd go backwards. And it was just a nightmare. Finally, a few days later, we got the transmission lined up and slid it onto the engine. I started bolting everything down. I put the axles on. I hooked up the drive shaft. I hooked up the wiring. I got everything back together. I filled it with fluids. I hopped in the car. I started it, and something wasn't right. I couldn't push the clutch in. Why didn't I try the clutch before I put the axles back in, before I put the drive shaft, all that stuff? I have no idea. And immediately I'm like, there's no way I just did that. I already learned this lesson. Why did I do that? There's no way I installed that clutch disc backwards. And I'm like freaking out. I'm like, there's no way. And thankfully, I was filming a video. I documented the entire process. So I went back through my filmed footage and I looked, and even in the video, I told people to install it with the right side. So I saw in the video that I had the correct side facing out, and I knew that that was installed correctly. I was like, okay, I knew I wasn't that stupid. I learned from that already. So what could it be? And I'm watching videos of me installing everything, and then I went on YouTube and found a video of someone else installing it. I'm like, wait, this looks a little bit different. I had never had a pull-style throwout bearing before, or a release bearing. I had only had push-style throwout bearings, and the STI uses a pull-style release bearing, and I'd never had that before. Well, I messed up, and I installed it backwards, similar to the clutch disc. So basically, I just assumed that I would know how it goes, and I installed it backwards. So another valuable lesson is never assume you know how something works. Just always double check, especially with a big project like that and something so simple. Because then the throwout bearing that I installed was all screwed up, or the release bearing, so I had to go get a new release bearing and install it correctly, and it was a nightmare. We pulled the transmission, or we slid the transmission back so that I could get in there, remove the release bearing, install the new one, and then we had the same trouble getting it lined back up because at the time we had all the weight of the transmission leaning backwards on those bottom studs. It bent the bottom studs coming off the block, and it was just a nightmare. But we got it all back together eventually. I got it back together with the help of my coworkers, helping me push that thing back in. I got it all put back together, fired it up, and the car ran great after that. There's always going to be mistakes that you make in the automotive industry. Anytime you're working on cars, you're always bound to make a mistake. Even if you're the best mechanic, everyone messes up, everyone makes mistakes. I just think it's fun to share these with people. Maybe it'll help you someday, or maybe you just get a little bit of fun listening to my stories. But This was a different video I thought I'd try. If you guys enjoyed it, let me know in the comments. Maybe I'll do something else like this. But anyways, I'll talk to you in the comments section, and I'll see you guys in the next video.